the night had arrived. The evening that Clara had been waiting for, the one where she would celebrate her 15 years of marriage to Marcus. It was supposed to be a night of romance, an anniversary dinner at one of Boston's most exclusive French restaurants, Le Papillon. The table was set perfectly, the crystal glasses sparkling under soft candlelight, the menu meticulously chosen, and the vintage Dom Perignon waiting for them to savor. But as the door to the restaurant opened, everything changed. She stepped inside, hand resting on her swollen belly, the elegant sway of her dress catching the light. Sophie. The woman Marcus had been seeing behind Clara's back for months. She was 7 months pregnant, her eyes bright with a mix of arrogance and excitement, completely unaware of the storm she was about to unleash. Clara didn't flinch. Her hands were steady as she reached for her champagne glass, lifting it to her lips. She didn't let the surprise show on her face, not even a twitch. The evening she had planned for months, the night she thought would be just for her and Marcus, had already been turned upside down. "Surprise, darling," Sophie chirped, her voice high-pitched and sweet, too sweet to be genuine. She didn't notice how Marcus stiffened beside her, his face a strange mixture of panic and regret. Sophie's hand rested on her belly possessively, as though marking her territory. Clara met her gaze across the table, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. There was no anger, no frustration in Clara's expression, just a serene calm, as if the universe had made it clear that tonight was no longer about an anniversary. It was about something much bigger. 15 years of marriage. Gone. Reduced to a cruel spectacle in one of the most prestigious restaurants in Boston. Marcus stared at Clara, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to speak, but no words came. Sophie, though, was oblivious. She had no idea what Clara had been planning. Had no idea that tonight was not about a confrontation, it was about the end of Marcus's carefully constructed life, a life built on lies, deceit, and manipulation. Clara hadn't been blindsided. No, she'd been waiting for this moment, orchestrating every detail for months, and now it was unfolding exactly as she had planned. Sophie's voice broke the silence again, the smugness in her tone cutting through the thick air. "I thought you should hear it from me, Clara," she said, her hand resting on her pregnant belly as if it were a trophy. "Marcus and I are having a baby." Clara's grip on her champagne glass didn't waver. Her expression remained unreadable. "How interesting," she murmured, her voice smooth, as if Sophie had just told her the weather forecast for tomorrow. "And when did this happen?" Sophie, clearly delighted by the opportunity to share her news, leaned forward, her smile wide. 7 months ago. "We're due in January," she said proudly. Clara didn't break her gaze. The warmth in her voice was completely intentional. "Fascinating," she repeated, taking a small sip of her champagne. "And I assume you conceived around the time of the hospital's annual fundraiser?" Sophie's smile faltered for a moment. She glanced at Marcus, who was now visibly uncomfortable, his eyes shifting from Clara to Sophie and back again. He knew this wasn't going to end well. He had underestimated Clara. He always had. Marcus tried to speak, his voice cracking. "Rebecca, I..." Clara raised her hand, silencing him with a simple gesture. There was no need for him to explain. The truth had already been laid bare. "I don't need to hear it from you, Marcus," she said, her tone soft, almost kind, but there was an edge to it that sent a shiver down his spine. "You thought you could keep your secrets, your lies, but here we are." Clara wasn't angry. Not yet. But she wasn't about to let Marcus or Sophie get away with this. This was just the beginning. And neither of them realized it yet. As Sophie settled into her seat, still beaming with triumph, Clara allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She had already won. Clara's gaze never wavered from Marcus. She could feel the tension building between them, like a slowly tightening vice, but her expression remained cool. Sophie had taken her seat beside Marcus, her smile still wide, oblivious to the storm that was already brewing. Clara watched as Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his nervous energy palpable. His fingers twitched, reaching for his wine glass, but he quickly retracted his hand, almost as if he feared it might betray him. Clara's voice broke the silence, soft yet carrying an unmistakable weight. "I'm surprised it took you this long, Marcus," she said, her tone as smooth as silk. "But then again, I suppose I shouldn't be. You've always been good at hiding things. Pretending everything's fine while you build your little empire on lies." Sophie looked between them, clearly unsettled by the underlying tension that Clara's words had exposed. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly now. Clara turned her attention to Sophie, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, you wouldn't know, would you?" she said, almost in mock sympathy. "You were too busy enjoying the fruits of Marcus's deceit to pay attention to the bigger picture." Sophie's confused gaze shifted from Clara to Marcus, and Clara watched the flicker of doubt pass over her face. She didn't know it yet, but she had already begun to unravel everything. "Marcus," Clara continued, turning her focus back to him, "you've always been able to lie your way out of everything, haven't you? Pretending to be the devoted husband, the respected oncologist. But behind that facade, well, I think it's time you met the real consequences of your actions." Marcus swallowed hard. "Rebecca, please," he began, his voice shaking. "I never meant for things to get out of hand. I was going to tell you." Clara cut him off with a single, effortless motion. She raised her hand, not out of anger, but to command silence. "Enough, Marcus," she said firmly. "I don't want to hear your excuses. I've been watching you for a long time. All your lies, your manipulations. And now, well, it's time for you to face the music." Sophie looked between them, her expression becoming more and more uncertain. Clara could see the cracks beginning to form in Sophie's confident exterior. Sophie had thought this was going to be her victory, the moment she could finally flaunt the child she was carrying, the child that would forever tie her to Marcus. What Sophie didn't realize was that her little announcement had already sealed her fate. Clara took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne, her eyes never leaving Sophie's. The moment was building, the tension palpable, and yet Clara's calm demeanor made it all the more unnerving. There was something unsettling about her composure, something that suggested she was in complete control. Before the situation could spiral any further, Clara's mind began to shift gears. She had already planted the seed of doubt in Sophie's mind, and now it was time to let it grow. "I see you're wearing my necklace, Sophie," Clara said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Sophie froze, her hand instinctively rising to touch the sapphire pendant hanging around her neck. Her fingers trembled ever so slightly, but it was enough for Clara to notice. Clara allowed herself a small, knowing smile. "Yes, that's right," she continued. "That necklace belonged to my mother. Funny how it disappeared during the renovation of our summer house. How fitting that you decided to wear it tonight, on this most memorable evening." Marcus's face paled, the color draining from his skin as he realized what Clara was implying. Sophie, however, remained oblivious, her gaze flickering between Clara and Marcus, still not understanding the full scope of the situation. "I've been watching you, Marcus," Clara said quietly, her voice smooth like honey but carrying the weight of an avalanche. "I've known about the affair for months, but that's not even the worst of it. No, the worst part is what you've been doing behind closed doors. The lives you've ruined. The families you've destroyed, all for money. For your own gain." Sophie's eyes widened in shock. What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling now. Clara didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out a neatly folded envelope, placing it on the table with deliberate slowness. She met Marcus's gaze again, her eyes cold and unwavering. "I think you'll find this interesting," she said softly. Marcus swallowed, his hands visibly shaking as he reached for the envelope. He tore it open, the contents spilling onto the table in front of him. Clara watched as his face twisted in disbelief, his fingers trembling as he sifted through the documents. The silence was deafening. Clara leaned back in her chair, savoring the moment. She knew exactly what was in the envelope: documents, medical records, financial statements. Proof of Marcus's corruption, his lies, and his fraudulent schemes. The falsified patient records, Clara continued, her voice steady. The insurance fraud. The patients who died in your experimental treatment wing, none of them were supposed to die. But you convinced them they were terminal so you could make millions. You killed them, Marcus. All for money. Sophie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she looked at Marcus in horror. No. This isn't possible, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Tell me this isn't true. But Marcus could barely speak. His mouth opened and closed, no words coming out. He looked at Clara, his eyes wide with panic. He had underestimated her, he had thought he could control this, that his charm and reputation could save him. But Clara had already orchestrated every detail, every step. And now, there was no escape. Clara turned to Sophie, her voice soft but firm. Did you really think you were special, Sophie? That you were the first? She asked, her tone almost pitying. You should ask Marcus about Dr. Sarah Martinez from 3 years ago, or Nurse Jessica Thompson before that. Neither of them was foolish enough to get pregnant. But you? You're just another pawn in his game. Sophie's face crumbled. Her confident facade shattered, and Clara could see the realization hit her like a tidal wave. She had been played, just like every other woman before her. And now, she was trapped. The restaurant was eerily quiet now, the once vibrant ambience of Le Papillon muted by the heavy weight of Clara's revelations. The soft clink of silverware, the murmur of other diners, all of it seemed distant, irrelevant. There was only this moment, this confrontation, and the slow unraveling of a man who had built his life on lies. Clara's eyes flickered to the maitre d', who was standing near the entrance, his gaze locked on her. She gave him the smallest nod, barely perceptible, but it was enough. The plan was already in motion. Before I share what happened next, the moment that left an entire room of journalists in stunned silence, I want to connect with you, my amazing viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever had to fight for something you believe in, hit that like button, because this story is just getting started. Sophie turned her gaze back to Clara, her face pale, her body trembling. What happens now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara met her gaze steadily. Now, Marcus, she said, turning her focus back to him, you're going to pay for everything you've done. Your secrets will be exposed, your life will unravel. And there's nothing you can do to stop it. The pieces were falling into place. This was just the beginning. And Marcus had no idea what was about to hit him. The tension in the room had shifted. It was no longer about the shock of Sophie's revelation or the public humiliation Marcus had hoped to inflict on Clara. No, now the atmosphere was thick with the weight of truth, and Clara's calm, measured voice continued to slice through the chaos like a surgeon's scalpel. Sophie was trembling now, her face pale as she looked back and forth between Clara and Marcus. Clara could see the fear creeping into her expression, the realization that she had been nothing more than another pawn in Marcus's grand game. She was in way over her head, and there was no way out. Clara had already turned the tables, but this was just the beginning. She knew that the deepest cuts, those that would truly destroy Marcus, were still to come. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze never leaving his. You think you can still talk your way out of this? Clara asked softly, almost as if she were asking a simple question. You've always been so good at that, Marcus. Charming your way into people's lives, convincing them you were the good guy, the one they could trust. But trust me, tonight you're not going to be able to lie your way out of this. Not this time. Marcus's face had gone from pale to ashen, his breath shallow as he looked from the documents on the table to Clara. The panic in his eyes was palpable, but it wasn't the kind of fear that comes from a simple mistake, it was the fear of someone who realized that everything they had worked for, everything they had carefully built, was about to come crashing down. Clara didn't need to say more. The evidence was in front of them, each document, each piece of information like a puzzle piece slowly revealing the true picture. She watched as Marcus's hands trembled, his fingers running over the paperwork, his eyes darting between the documents and Clara's steady gaze. She knew he was trying to make sense of what was happening. He was trying to process how his perfect world had just been shattered in front of him. He was used to being in control, used to having the power to manipulate every situation. But now, in the face of Clara's quiet but unwavering strength, he was powerless. "Let me help you, Marcus," Clara continued, her voice low and steady. "I know how hard it must be to face the truth. You thought you could get away with it, didn't you? The fake charity work, the money laundering, the patients you killed, all for profit. But now, it's all here, laid out in black and white. You can't talk your way out of this." Clara placed her hands on the table, her fingers resting lightly on the edges of the documents she had laid out for him. She had been gathering evidence for months, every phone call, every meeting, every interaction meticulously documented. She had everything she needed, and Marcus knew it. The truth was out. Sophie's eyes were wide now, her breathing shallow as she looked at the evidence in front of her. She didn't understand how deep the rabbit hole went. She didn't know the half of it, and Clara intended to make sure she did. But it wasn't just about Sophie. It was about the countless victims who had suffered at Marcus's hands, patients who had trusted him, families who had believed in him, and the lives he had stolen for his own gain. Clara let out a long, slow breath, her eyes never leaving Marcus. "I thought you should hear it from me, too," she said, her voice now carrying the weight of everything she had learned. "It's not just the patients you killed, Marcus. It's the ones you ruined. The families you destroyed. All for what? For money? For power?" Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He was shaking now, unable to keep his composure. It wasn't just the fact that his secrets had been exposed, it was the knowledge that his carefully crafted image, the one that had made him one of the most respected oncologists in the country, was now shattered. All of it, gone. Clara continued, her words like a steady drumbeat, hammering home the reality that Marcus had been trying so desperately to avoid. "Let me remind you of a few things, Marcus. The falsified patient records, the insurance fraud, the deaths in your experimental wing. You didn't care about saving lives. You didn't care about medical ethics. You only cared about lining your pockets with blood money." Sophie recoiled at the words, her face crumpling as she began to realize the depth of the situation. "No, that's not possible," she whispered, shaking her head. "You're lying." Clara turned her gaze to her, her voice cold and precise. "You really think Marcus is the victim here, Sophie? He's the one who lied to you, not the other way around. You think you're the first woman he's used to cover his tracks? You're not. You're just the latest in a long line." Sophie opened her mouth to protest, but Clara held up a hand, silencing her. "You really have no idea, do you? About Dr. Sarah Martinez, who was the first to notice something wasn't right? Or Nurse Jessica Thompson, who started asking questions before she was pushed out? They're just a few of the people you don't know about. And now, Marcus, I think it's time you meet the rest." Clara reached into her purse and pulled out another envelope, much thicker than the first one. She placed it on the table with deliberate care, making sure Marcus could see it clearly. "You've been so careful, haven't you? Keeping your secrets, hiding the evidence. But I've been watching you, Marcus. And now, everything is coming to light." Sophie leaned forward, peering at the papers. She looked up at Marcus, her face filled with confusion and fear. What is this?" she asked, her voice shaky. Clara smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who had won, someone who had been patient and deliberate in their approach. "This, Sophie, is the proof of Marcus's crimes. The deaths he's caused. The lives he's destroyed. The people who trusted him, and now, they'll get justice." Marcus stared at the documents, his face going even paler than before. His hands gripped the table, and he tried to speak, but his voice failed him. Clara wasn't done yet. She had only scratched the surface. You see, Marcus, Clara continued, her voice growing colder with each word, what you didn't count on was me. You thought you could control everything, that you could get away with it. But what you never realized was that I was always 2 steps ahead of you. I've been watching, gathering evidence, making sure that when this moment came, there would be no escape for you. The restaurant was silent now, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Clara's gaze never left Marcus's face as she spoke, watching the realization slowly dawn on him. It was as though she could see the walls of his world crumbling, piece by piece, and she reveled in it. Clara's eyes flicked to the maitre d', who stood at the door, his gaze fixed on her, waiting for her signal. She nodded ever so slightly, and he gave her a subtle, but very definite, nod in return. Marcus, Clara said, her voice quiet but final, this is just the beginning. You thought tonight was your moment of triumph, didn't you? You thought you were going to humiliate me, break me down. But instead, you've just signed your own death sentence. Not literally, of course. But everything you've built, the life you've stolen from others, is about to be torn apart. Marcus couldn't speak. He couldn't do anything but sit there, watching as his world unraveled in front of him. The maitre d' walked to their table with an envelope in hand, his steps slow and deliberate. He handed the envelope to Clara, who glanced at it briefly, before setting it down on the table. Here's the final piece, Marcus, she said. The last thing you thought you could hide from me. This, right here, is the footage from your office, showing you falsifying medical records, meeting with insurance adjusters, and making deposits into your private accounts. Sophie gasped, her eyes wide with horror as the full scope of Marcus's crimes began to sink in. She looked at him for answers, but there were no answers left. The man she thought she knew had disappeared. All that was left was the cold, heartless truth. Clara stood up, her voice ringing clear and true. By tomorrow morning, Marcus, the world will know what you've done. The medical board, the FBI, they'll all know what kind of monster you really are. The final blow had been struck, and Marcus was powerless to stop it. As Clara turned and walked toward the door, she felt a sense of finality wash over her. It was over. Marcus's empire was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to save himself now. The truth had come to light. And with it, Marcus's destruction was inevitable. The air in the restaurant was thick with the tension that hung between Clara, Marcus, and Sophie. It was a silence so profound, it almost felt like the world outside had stopped. The clinking of silverware, the hushed whispers of nearby diners, all of it faded into the background as the reality of the situation took hold. Clara could see it in Marcus's eyes, the recognition that everything he had worked so hard for, everything he had built over the years, was crumbling around him. Sophie was still in a state of disbelief, her hands trembling as she clutched her belly protectively, as though that one gesture could shield her from the devastation unfolding before her. Clara didn't need to say anything more. The documents, the evidence, the truth, it was all laid out before them. Marcus had no escape. He could run, he could beg, but the lies he had woven so carefully had finally been unraveled. He had underestimated Clara. He had thought that bringing Sophie into their anniversary dinner would be his moment of triumph. But in doing so, he had sealed his own fate. Sophie shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her gaze darting between Clara and Marcus. She could no longer pretend she didn't know the depth of the situation. The facade that had once seemed so solid had begun to crack, and she was starting to see Marcus for what he truly was, a man who had deceived everyone in his life, from his colleagues to the patients who had trusted him, and now to the woman sitting beside him. "Tell me it's not true, Marcus," Sophie whispered, her voice shaky. "Tell me you didn't do any of this." Marcus looked at her, his mouth opening and closing, but no words coming out. His face was ashen, his composure shattered. For the first time in his life, he didn't have the answers. He didn't have the power to manipulate the situation. He had been outplayed. Clara's voice, soft yet commanding, broke the silence. It's too late for denial, Marcus. The evidence is irrefutable. There's no escape. You're finished. Sophie's hand flew to her mouth, the reality of what Clara was saying starting to sink in. Marcus had always been the center of her world, the man who had made her believe that their love, their future, was real. But now, with every word Clara spoke, that illusion was shattering. She was just another piece in his game, another person he had used for his own gain. Clara continued, her voice steady and unyielding. You thought you could get away with it, didn't you? You thought your reputation as a renowned oncologist would protect you. You thought your charm could cover up the lives you've ruined. But tonight, everything changes. Tonight, the truth comes to light. Marcus opened his mouth, a pitiful attempt to speak, but Clara wasn't having it. No more excuses, she said, her tone final. No more lies. You're not fooling anyone anymore, least of all me. Sophie looked back at him, her eyes wide with shock, her voice barely a whisper. How long, Marcus? How long have you been doing this? Clara's gaze never left Marcus's face. Years, Sophie. Years. This wasn't just a one-time mistake. Marcus has been manipulating people for as long as I've known him. He's been killing patients, falsifying records, and stealing money from insurance companies to fund his own lavish lifestyle. And now, it's all coming to an end. Sophie looked like she was about to collapse. Her whole world was falling apart. The man she had trusted, the man who had promised her the world, had been playing her just like he had played everyone else. And now, she was caught in the middle of it all. How could you do this, Marcus? Sophie asked, her voice breaking. How could you kill people? How could you do this to me? To us? Clara took a deep breath, letting the weight of her words settle in the air before continuing. It was never about us, Sophie. It was never about love. Marcus never cared about anyone but himself. And now, everyone is going to know the truth. The sound of the maitre d' approaching the table broke the heavy silence, and for the first time since the evening began, Clara allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. The maitre d' handed her an envelope, his face neutral, but Clara could see the faintest hint of approval in his eyes. He had been part of the plan all along, his role as an accomplice ensuring that Marcus's downfall would be perfectly executed. Clara opened the envelope slowly, savoring the moment. Inside, there was a USB drive and a stack of photographs. She glanced at Marcus, her eyes cold. I've been gathering evidence for months, Marcus. I've watched you every step of the way. Every conversation, every deal, every manipulation. It's all on here. Every death. Every lie. Every crime you've committed. Marcus's eyes widened in horror as Clara placed the USB drive on the table, the weight of its contents too much for him to bear. He had no more power. No more control. All of it was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. How many, Marcus? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. How many people did you kill for money? How many lives did you destroy just to line your pockets? He didn't answer. He couldn't. His entire empire had been built on a foundation of lies and deception, and now it was crumbling, piece by piece. Clara stood up, her eyes never leaving Marcus's face. She knew that this was the moment. The turning point. Marcus had been the one pulling the strings for so long, but now it was Clara's turn to control the narrative. This is just the beginning, Marcus, Clara said, her voice unwavering. By tomorrow morning, every major hospital board in the country will have copies of this. The medical board. The insurance companies. The FBI. They'll all know what you've done. And by the end of the week, you'll be nothing more than a footnote in the history of medical malpractice. The room seemed to hold its breath as Clara turned and walked toward the exit. Marcus's world had come to a screeching halt. The man who had once been at the top of his field, revered by his peers, respected by his colleagues, was now exposed for what he truly was, a fraud, a killer, a liar. But Clara wasn't done. She had more to say. More to reveal. As she reached the door, she turned back to face Marcus one final time. "Do you know what the most ironic part of all this is, Marcus?" Clara said, her voice laced with bitterness. "You thought tonight would be your victory. You thought you could humiliate me, break me down in front of everyone. But in the end, you're the one who's been exposed. You're the one who's been destroyed." Marcus could barely move, his face frozen in a mask of terror. Clara knew that he was realizing, too late, that this was it. The end. His empire, his career, his reputation, they were all gone. Sophie looked at him, her expression a mix of confusion, fear, and disbelief. "What happens now?" she whispered. Clara didn't answer right away. She just stood there, staring at Marcus as he sat frozen in his chair, knowing that there was nothing he could do to change what had already happened. The truth had come to light. And now, Marcus's fall was inevitable. The turning point had arrived. The game was over. Clara turned and walked out of the restaurant, the weight of her victory settling in her chest. She knew that the road ahead would be long, that justice would take time. But for now, she had won. She had exposed Marcus for the monster he was, and nothing would ever be the same again. As she stepped into the cool night air, Clara couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. She had been waiting for this moment for so long, and now that it had arrived, there was a sense of peace in knowing that Marcus's reign of terror had come to an end. And for the first time in years, Clara felt like she could finally breathe again. The morning after Marcus's exposure felt like a new beginning, though it came with the weight of the world still heavy on Clara's shoulders. The night had been a blur of emotions, the final confrontation at the restaurant only the start of the whirlwind that would soon unfold. As she stepped into her office, her phone lit up with notifications, messages, calls, and news updates all buzzing in unison, each one confirming what she already knew. The truth had already spread like wildfire. Marcus's world had come crashing down, and Clara was now standing at the epicenter of it all. She took a deep breath and checked the time. It was just past 8 a.m., and already, the ripple effects of Marcus's fall were reverberating through every corner of the medical community. Clara's mind raced, but she kept her focus steady. She had been preparing for this moment for months, and now, she would make sure the world saw it through to the end. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Agent Cooper, the FBI agent who had been quietly tracking Marcus's every move. His response came through in a single sentence: "It's done. Marcus is in custody." Clara couldn't help but smile. This was just the beginning, but it was the moment that had made all the sleepless nights, the constant strategizing, and the careful preparations worthwhile. She had done it. And now, the people who had suffered under Marcus's twisted reign would finally have their voices heard. The door to her office opened, and Dr. Eleanor Reynolds, the head of the ethics committee, walked in. Eleanor's face was somber, but Clara could see the flicker of resolve in her eyes. She had been there since the beginning, offering her support when Clara's plan seemed too ambitious, too dangerous. But Eleanor had believed in Clara's vision. She had known this day would come. "How are you holding up?" Eleanor asked, sitting across from Clara, her voice filled with quiet sympathy. Clara exhaled slowly. "I'm fine," she said, meeting Eleanor's gaze. "This was never about me. It's about the families. About the truth finally coming to light. Marcus thought he could control everything, his career, his reputation, his victims, but in the end, he couldn't control the truth." Eleanor nodded, but there was a sharpness to her voice when she spoke again. "The hospital board is calling an emergency meeting. They want you there. It's time for them to hear what Marcus was really doing in that department." Clara's heart skipped a beat. The hospital board. The very institution that had trusted Marcus, that had allowed his fraudulent experiments to continue unchecked. But now, they would be forced to confront the devastation he had caused. "I'll be there," Clara replied, her voice steady. "They need to hear everything. They need to understand how deep this went." The phone buzzed once more, and Clara glanced at the screen. It was an email from her private investigator, Michael, who had been gathering evidence for weeks. He had been invaluable in helping her uncover the web of lies that Marcus had carefully woven. The file is complete. Everything's in place. It's time to take down the rest of the network. Clara's gaze hardened as she read the message. This wasn't over. The next step in her plan had already begun. Marcus was just one piece of the puzzle. There were others, nurses, administrators, and doctors who had turned a blind eye to Marcus's actions, or worse, had been complicit in his scheme. They would all have to answer for what they had done. The boardroom was tense. The once esteemed leaders of the hospital now sat in silence, their faces pale as they absorbed the full extent of Marcus's crimes. Clara had laid out the evidence in front of them, the medical records, the falsified death certificates, the patient testimonies, and, most damning of all, the video footage of Marcus in his office, altering medical files, meeting with insurance adjusters, and laughing as he manipulated the system. One of the board members, Dr. Alan Pierce, a senior surgeon who had always trusted Marcus, looked like he had been struck by a physical blow. His hands trembled as he shuffled through the papers in front of him. How could we have not seen this? Dr. Pierce murmured, his voice barely audible. Clara's gaze was cold, but her tone was firm. Because you chose to believe Marcus. You trusted him because he was a star in your department. He had the reputation, the charm, the connections. But none of you ever bothered to question the rising mortality rates, the unusual insurance claims, the fact that patients were dying under his care. Another board member, Dr. Margaret Liu, who had worked alongside Marcus for years, now looked horrified. We had no idea, she whispered, her voice shaking. This is monstrous. Clara didn't flinch. No. What's monstrous is that none of you did anything. You allowed this to go on, and now people are dead. Families are grieving. And you're all complicit. A murmur of discomfort passed through the room, but Clara didn't give them the chance to hide behind guilt. She had come here for one reason, to make sure the hospital would never allow something like this to happen again. We will be implementing an immediate review of every case Marcus handled in the past 5 years, Clara said, her voice commanding. Every single one. We will audit all the patients who were transferred into the experimental wing. We will investigate every drug trial, every treatment plan. And we will open up the records to the families of every patient Marcus killed. The room was silent as the board members exchanged uneasy glances. Clara knew they were regretting their blind faith in Marcus. But she didn't care about their regret. She wasn't here to make them feel better. She was here to make sure that the truth would be heard, and that Marcus's legacy of destruction would be eradicated. Dr. Eleanor Reynolds, who had been sitting quietly beside Clara, stood up. We are also creating a task force, she said, her voice steady. A team dedicated to ensuring that no doctor, no administrator, is ever allowed to operate with this kind of unchecked power again. We will create a system of oversight, with mandatory external audits for all experimental treatments. We will also establish an anonymous reporting system so that employees can speak up without fear of retaliation. Clara nodded in approval. This was the real victory. Justice wasn't just about bringing Marcus down, it was about ensuring that no one could ever repeat his mistakes. And it was about ensuring that the families who had lost loved ones would be compensated. Back in her office, Clara finally allowed herself a moment of quiet. The phone rang, and she picked it up without hesitation. It was Agent Cooper again. It's over, Clara, he said, his voice filled with satisfaction. Marcus is behind bars. The FBI has all the evidence we need to bring down the rest of the network. We're starting with his associates, the doctors, the nurses, the administrators who were involved. They'll all be investigated. Clara leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. And what about the families? She asked softly. They'll get justice, Cooper replied. We're working on a compensation fund. The money Marcus earned through his crimes will be used to cover medical expenses for the victims' families. We'll make sure they're taken care of. Clara's heart lifted slightly. It wasn't everything, but it was something. She had fought for this. She had fought for the people who had trusted Marcus, who had been betrayed by him. And now, they would finally have some semblance of justice. As she hung up the phone, Clara looked out the window at the city below. The road ahead would be long. The work was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, Clara felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had taken down a man who had caused unimaginable pain. She had exposed the truth, and now, it was time for the healing to begin. The families of Marcus's victims would never get their loved ones back. But Clara could give them something more important, the knowledge that the man who had taken them from them would never hurt anyone again. And that was justice. Clara's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Claire Morrison, the daughter of one of Marcus's first victims. Clara had met her during the investigation, and they had kept in touch ever since. "We did it, Clara. My mom's case is finally getting the attention it deserves. You were right. This is just the beginning. Thank you for everything." Clara smiled, her heart swelling with pride. Justice had been served. The truth had come to light, and the lives of those who had been taken by Marcus's greed and manipulation would not be forgotten. Clara knew that she had won. Not just for herself, but for every victim, every family, every life that had been touched by Marcus's cruelty. And though the fight was far from over, for the first time, Clara felt a true sense of peace. Her work was far from done. But today, she had won the battle. And that, in itself, was a victory. A year had passed since the night that had turned Marcus's world upside down. The once untouchable oncologist, revered by colleagues and patients alike, was now a name whispered with disgust and shame. The years of deception, manipulation, and the lives lost in his wake had finally come to light, and the world would never forget the story of Marcus Thorne. But for Clara, the journey didn't end with his arrest. It had only just begun. As she walked through the bustling halls of the hospital, Clara couldn't help but reflect on how far everything had come since that fateful night. The medical center, once a place of quiet power for Marcus, was now a beacon of change. The experimental wing, which had once been his pride and joy, had been transformed. It had a new name, the Morrison Memorial Research Center, and its focus was no longer on fraudulent treatments or dangerous medical practices. Now, it was a hub for ethical research, for true innovation in oncology, where patient care was the priority and transparency was at the heart of every decision. Clara stood outside the center's new entrance, the crisp autumn air brushing against her skin as she watched a new generation of doctors and researchers file inside. They were part of the change she had worked so hard to implement. They were the future, one that would no longer be tainted by the darkness that had once defined this place. She hadn't expected it to be easy. The battle for reform, for justice, was a long one, and it had taken its toll. But Clara had stood her ground, and the world around her had begun to shift. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and Clara pulled it out to find a message from Claire Morrison. She had become one of Clara's closest allies, a woman who had turned her grief into action, helping push for changes not only within the hospital but across the medical community. "I wanted to let you know that the first class of medical ethics fellows is graduating today. They're the ones who will carry on the work you started. We couldn't have done this without you." Clara smiled, her heart swelling with pride. When she first met Claire, she had been a grieving daughter, trying to make sense of the tragedy that had stolen her mother from her. But over time, Claire had become more than just a victim of Marcus's cruelty. She had become a force for change, a leader who was shaping the future of medical ethics and patient advocacy. The ripple effect of the work they had done together had spread far beyond the hospital walls. The Marcus Thorne Patient Protection Act had passed, becoming a landmark piece of legislation that introduced sweeping reforms to protect patients from the kinds of exploitation Marcus had orchestrated. It mandated independent audits of all experimental treatments, required transparency in medical research, and created a national database to track unusual patterns in medical trials. It wasn't just about punishing the wrongdoers, it was about preventing future atrocities. And in that, Clara had found her true calling. She walked into the new research center, where a ceremony was being held to honor the first group of medical fellows who had completed the new ethics program. The room was filled with bright young faces, eager to learn, eager to make a difference. It was a stark contrast to the dark days when Marcus had held sway over this very building. Clara took her seat in the front row, the weight of the years lifting as she saw the impact of her efforts unfold before her. The students were now armed with the knowledge and the tools to identify and prevent the kinds of systemic failures that had allowed Marcus's reign of terror to last so long. They were ready to carry the torch forward. As the ceremony progressed, Clara found herself thinking back to the families who had been affected by Marcus's actions. The ones who had trusted him, only to find their loved ones lost in the name of greed. She remembered the night at Le Papillon, the way Marcus's betrayal had been exposed in front of the world. But she also remembered the strength of those families, their determination to seek justice, to make sure Marcus's actions were not forgotten. One by one, the graduates walked up to accept their diplomas, shaking Clara's hand with respect and admiration. She was more than just the woman who had brought Marcus down. She had become a symbol of resilience, a symbol of hope for those who had been betrayed by the very institutions meant to protect them. The ceremony ended, but Clara stayed behind, watching the graduates mingle with their families, celebrating the new chapter in their lives. The center, once a symbol of corruption, now stood as a testament to what could be accomplished when people refused to turn a blind eye to injustice. Later that day, Clara found herself back at the hospital, in a meeting with the board of directors. This wasn't just any meeting, it was one where the hospital would finalize its commitment to the new ethical guidelines that Clara had helped put in place. These weren't just protocols to follow, they were a promise to the families who had been wronged, a promise to the patients who trusted the medical community to do right by them. The board had already agreed to the new guidelines, but Clara had one final request. She wanted the hospital to offer reparations to the families who had lost loved ones due to Marcus's crimes. She knew that no amount of money could bring back those they had lost, but it was a step toward healing. A way to acknowledge the pain that had been caused. The conversation was long, but Clara was patient. She knew that change didn't happen overnight, it took time, it took persistence, and most of all, it took the willingness to challenge the status quo. But as she looked around the room at the faces of the hospital's leaders, she saw something she hadn't seen before, a genuine commitment to change. "We owe it to the families," Clara said, her voice steady. "We owe it to the patients who trusted us. And we owe it to the future of medicine. This hospital will lead the way in ethical patient care. We will prove that trust is earned, not taken for granted." As the meeting came to a close, Clara felt a sense of finality. The battle for justice had been fought, and now the work of healing and rebuilding could begin. But there was something more she needed to do. She had one final stop to make. That evening, Clara stood outside the courthouse, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. She had come to this place many times in the past year, each time with a sense of purpose. But tonight, there was a quiet finality to her steps. The families of Marcus's victims had gathered to watch as justice was served one last time, this time, not in the form of a trial or an arrest, but in the form of a memorial. The courthouse had agreed to dedicate a small section of its courtyard to the victims of medical fraud. It would be a place where families could come to honor their loved ones and where future generations could learn the importance of accountability and transparency in the healthcare system. Clara had worked with Claire Morrison to make this happen, and tonight, they would unveil the memorial. The families were already gathered, some wiping away tears, others simply standing in quiet reflection. Clara looked at each of them, knowing that their lives had been changed forever by the man they had trusted. But tonight, they would be remembered. Their voices would be heard, their stories would be told. The ceremony was brief, but powerful. Clara spoke of the importance of remembering those who had been lost, of ensuring that their deaths were not in vain. She spoke of the future, a future where the kind of corruption Marcus had created would no longer be tolerated. And she spoke of the power of the people in that room, the families, the survivors, the advocates, who had made this change possible. As the evening drew to a close, Clara took a step back, looking at the memorial. The names of the victims were etched into the stone, each one a reminder of the lives that had been stolen and the justice that had been fought for. The families gathered around, placing flowers at the base of the memorial, each one adding their own tribute. For Clara, this was the true victory. Not just in bringing Marcus to justice, but in ensuring that the people who had been affected by his actions would never be forgotten. They had become the catalyst for change. They had given the world a new standard to live by. The years that followed were filled with more work, more advocacy, and more change. Clara continued her work with the Medical Ethics Committee, traveling across the country to help hospitals and clinics implement the same ethical standards she had fought so hard to establish. She was a tireless advocate for transparency and patient rights, a voice for those who had been silenced. But as the years passed, Clara allowed herself to think less about Marcus and more about the future. The work she had done was making a difference, and that was enough. She could rest easy knowing that, through the pain and the heartbreak, she had helped create something lasting. A legacy of justice, compassion, and ethical care. As Clara looked at the horizon, she knew the fight was far from over. But for now, she could allow herself a moment of peace. She had faced the darkness and had come out stronger on the other side. And the world, for the first time in a long time, was a little bit brighter for it. Clara stood in front of her office window, gazing out over the city that had witnessed so much transformation over the past year. The evening light bathed the towering buildings in gold, but within Clara, there was no longer any darkness from revenge or the hidden secrets that had once plagued her. She had fought for what was right, and she had won. Everything had changed, not just because Marcus was exposed, but because of the belief in justice and protection of patients that she had restored. Yet Clara's journey didn't end here. Over the year, she continued to receive messages from the families of victims, from hospitals, medical professionals, and scholars, all acknowledging the changes she had helped bring about. The healthcare system was no longer a place where medical fraud could thrive unchecked. She had established new ethical standards, and now it was her mission to ensure that those standards would never be compromised. As she reflected on all the work she had done, Clara realized that each day she received more confirmation that her battle had been worth it. The work continued to spread, with new hospitals and medical centers adopting her reforms. It wasn't just about taking down Marcus anymore, it was about a future where transparency, accountability, and the well-being of patients came first. One evening, Clara stood looking out of her office window, thinking about the path ahead. The city was alive with the energy of progress, and she knew, despite how much she had accomplished, her fight was far from over. But in that moment, she allowed herself to feel the satisfaction of what she had achieved. The system had changed, lives were being protected, and Marcus's reign of corruption had ended. Her phone buzzed, pulling her back to the present. It was a message from Claire Morrison, who had become more than just an ally in Clara's fight. Claire had turned her own grief into action, pushing for the changes that were now affecting the entire medical community. The first class of medical ethics fellows graduates today. They're the future you've helped create. We couldn't have done it without you. Clara smiled, her heart swelling with pride. When she had first met Claire, she had been a daughter grieving her mother, struggling to understand the death that Marcus had caused. But now, Claire was a leader in her own right, pushing forward reforms and ensuring that the system would never again allow the kind of corruption that Marcus had built. The impact of the changes Clara had set in motion was undeniable. The Marcus Thorne Patient Protection Act had been passed, a landmark piece of legislation mandating independent audits of all experimental treatments, ensuring transparency in medical research, and creating a national database to track unusual patterns in medical trials. It wasn't just about punishing wrongdoers, it was about preventing future atrocities. But even with all these victories, Clara knew that the fight for true reform would never be over. She had laid the foundation, but it was up to future generations to build upon it. And as she watched the new wave of medical ethics fellows preparing to step into their careers, she knew they were ready. Later that day, Clara found herself in the midst of another crucial meeting. The hospital board had agreed to her proposal for reparations for the families affected by Marcus's crimes. It was a small step toward healing, but Clara knew it was necessary. It wasn't just about punishing Marcus, it was about showing the world that the system could and would change for the better. As the meeting concluded, Clara felt a sense of finality. She had done what she set out to do. Marcus was no longer a shadow hanging over her life, and the reforms she had fought for were now a permanent part of the healthcare system. But Clara knew that there would always be more work to do, more hospitals to change, more systems to overhaul, and more people to fight for. That evening, as she stood once again outside the courthouse, Clara couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. The families of Marcus's victims had gathered to witness the final piece of justice being served, this time, not in the form of a trial or arrest, but through a memorial. The hospital had agreed to dedicate a section of its courtyard to those who had died at Marcus's hands, honoring their memory and ensuring their stories would never be forgotten. As Clara stood there, watching the families place flowers at the base of the memorial, she realized that this was the true victory, not just in exposing Marcus's crimes, but in ensuring that those who had been lost would never be erased from history. Their voices had been heard, and their deaths had not been in vain. The years that followed were filled with more work, more advocacy, and more change. Clara continued her efforts to help hospitals across the country adopt the ethical guidelines she had pioneered. She traveled, spoke at conferences, and worked tirelessly to make sure that the world would never again allow a man like Marcus to manipulate the system for his own gain. And as she reflected on the journey that had brought her here, on the dark moments and the hard-fought victories, Clara knew that she had done something that would last far beyond her own life. She had fought for justice, not just for herself, but for every patient, every family, and every medical professional who believed in doing what was right. The fight wasn't over, but Clara had made sure the battle would never be fought alone again. If you found inspiration in Clara's story and the way justice prevailed, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter in our ongoing mission to expose the truth and make a difference. And if you've ever been part of a fight for justice or change, drop a comment below. Your voice matters, and we'd love to hear your story. Thank you for watching. Together, we can continue making a difference.